Boardroom Bound, Episode 35, How to Triumph in the Board Diversity Battle with Stephanie Sonnabend.
Our message is twofold. One is to companies about the value of having a more diverse board, and the second message is to women about how to find board seats, get prepared, get qualified, so that they are available to be selected to be on board.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring and existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And in today's show, we're speaking with Stephanie Sonnabend. She is the co-founder and chair of the 2020 Women on Boards movement. And this is an organization that has grown from Boston in 2010 to become not only national, but now international movement dedicated to improving gender diversity on boards. Tremendous progress has been made, still a lot more to go. We will talk about that. We will talk about the differences for boards, the value added of having women on, what that means. And of course, we're not just talking about diversity for gender on board. There's whole sorts of different diversity. I call it diversity of thought. Any different category you can imagine. It's essential to have that to be able to innovate. But we will hear some of the statistics that underpin why this is so today. And of course, the value that comes from this organization, not only just promoting it, but helping educate, prepare women to be on the boards. And we'll talk about some of those nuggets today that you can apply to your own board career. So much to share. Let's jump into the show. Stephanie Sonnabend, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Alexander, it's great to be with you.
Well, I'm thrilled to have you on the show because you're helping lead as the co-founder and running the board of the 2020 Women on Boards movement. It's an organization that I support, thrilled to be part of the steering committee for the Boston event that we've got coming up. I know we'll talk about that, but maybe we can take a step back because it seems kind of obvious today that there should be an organization like this, and we'll talk about the progress. But it may not have been as obvious when it started, and it might have been hard to start. I would love to hear some of the history and how it came about.
Sure. So we started this in Boston in 2010 because we were dismayed by the lack of progress women were making in the boardroom. The fact remains is that the numbers hadn't moved in 10 years. And despite calls from women executives to add more women on board, nothing seemed to be happening. So we felt there was really an opportunity to create a new organization that would focus specifically on this issue.
And your name resonates, right? I think it was a very brilliantly campaign name from the beginning. Everyone could understand it and get behind it. I guess part of the problem now is as we get to 2019, we start to look ahead, I guess we'll have to rebrand in a different way, right?
Absolutely, and we've been having discussions at the board level and the strategic planning committee about what we're going to do when we reach 2020. And we have great plans that we're probably going to be sharing with people towards the end of 2019.
And I imagine and let's talk about the national conversation event on November 21st, because I imagine that might be a bit part of it there where we're sharing that with people. But this is an event that happens. So I'm in Boston. I'm part of that Boston chapter, but you've grown to a lot more than Boston. So help us understand, you have one night, this giant annual event where you will be raising the profile of this opportunity, but also sharing some of your statistics, some of which can be very shocking. Some are also encouraging, right? Help us understand, what is this national event that we're all talking about?
So this began in 2012 when we realized that, having started it in 2010 in Boston, that if we were going to be a real campaign, we needed to go national with it. And so we recruited volunteers from cities all over the country, and we now have over 30 cities that are participating in this, as well as some international events as well. And it's a day to spread awareness and advocate for more women on boards. And so our message is twofold. One is to companies about the value of having a more diverse board, and the second message is to women about how to find board seats, get prepared, get qualified, so that they are available to be selected to be on boards.
In some ways, that's a chicken-egg problem that you have to solve, right? Because you don't want to have all of these boards going, great, bring me the women I need, but then perhaps women not putting their hand up saying, great, I'm ready and I want this. So you're doing both in parallel, is that right?
Exactly. We help explain to women how to find a board seat as well as what it takes. So we encourage women to start when they're mid-career, really taking a look at this opportunity and figuring out how they can enhance their skills, experiences, reputation, visibility, so that when they're in a more senior level, they'll be very well qualified to be on boards.
And it's interesting because if we talk a little bit about gender dynamics, if we're going to go the highest level stereotyping, men can be more aggressive or assertive, however you want to say it, of saying, I'm going to go out there, I'm going to pound the pavement, I'm going to make sure all my people know I want to be on the boards, whether or not someone else thinks they're truly ready. If they've decided they're going to go for it, they're probably going to go for it. Whereas the stereotype on women might be, they might be highly qualified and prepared, but maybe don't have the confidence, maybe aren't going to go beat down the bushes, maybe don't have the same network because they took a career break to help raise a family. Help us understand some of those dynamics.
Well, the other thing that really oftentimes stands in the way of women is that boards say they're looking for a CEO of a, whether it's a Fortune 1000, Russell 3000 company. And there are relatively few women currently who are CEOs.
Right.
And so what we're encouraging companies to do is broaden their search to recognizing the value of diversity. So a woman who's run a decent-sized private company certainly could be a qualified board member, as well as other C-suite, whether it's CIO, CFO, CMO. Some of those titles also certainly are qualifiers, as well as people with either a human resources background or other non-conventional backgrounds. So the message to companies is to really look beyond just the CEO role when trying to recruit board members, especially women, because they certainly add value.
And I'd love your thoughts on whether this is, I don't know if I want to say the word easier, but whether this is actually becoming easier to convince boards, because we're starting to see changes in that process, right? So just as you said in the past, you either had to be a sitting CEO or a retired CEO, maybe a CFO, but that was really what they wanted. Now, in my impression, all of the C-suite is generally fair game, but we're also seeing this amazing trend where people are reaching down for, say, a core expert. Maybe it's cyber, maybe it's social media, different things like that, and taking them up earlier, partly probably by certain industries where they recognize we need different demographics, and maybe we want that visually on the board as much as understanding our customers. So I think they're beginning to change that. Maybe it's moving at a glacial pace compared to what you would like. Help us understand how the world is changing.
And yes, I would agree with that. I do think it's definitely changing because boards also are recognizing that they're quite old. And a group of 60-plus-year-old men sitting around the boardroom table may not be the most appropriate group to be making decisions about for people who are much, much younger. Yeah. So there is a push for as well to have some people who really understand younger consumers as well as older ones. And so that also is a good opportunity. And again, if you're going to look for younger board members, then you have to, again, look for opportunities for specialists who may not be at that C-suite level yet.
I would agree, and I would echo that from my own experience. My first significant board role, when I walked in, it was pale, male, and stale is the best way that I can think to describe it. And it was an opportunity where I realized instantly, I'm thinking, how is this organization really going to innovate? Because if you don't have different mindsets around you to have different discussion points, it doesn't mean you can't do it, but it becomes harder. I imagine that is part of the verbiage that you're using when you're talking to corporations, and I imagine that sinks in today. Do you agree?
Absolutely. We're focused on gender diversity, but we're really a proponent of all sorts of diversity. So that's both identity diversity, racial diversity, diversity of background, as well as gender. Age is certainly another one, geographic area. Mm-hmm. All of those areas are so important to create a well-rounded board.
I describe it as diversity of thought in all its forms, and I think that's just essential for organizations in a fast-changing world to be able to stay ahead of the game. Mm-hmm. And you're talking about all of this, not just from someone who is a proponent of it, you are that, but you've been in the club, right? So I would love to hear a bit about your career. You've been on multiple significant boards, and perhaps also how that has flavored the way that you think about this movement.
Okay, so my first board was actually Sonesta International Hotels Corporation, where I was working my way up to eventually become CEO and president. And I joined that board. That was a family business. I was one of 10 family members involved in the business, although all of us were not on the board. At any given time, there were 4 of us on the board. And so I joined that board. And very early on, I was very interested in diversifying that board. So even before I got on the board, I encouraged my father, who was the chairman, to add a woman, and then I was the second, and then we had a third, and finally a fourth. When we sold the business in 2012, we had a model for what I call a diverse board. We had 6 men, 4 women, and 2 African American men as well. So it was a great cross section and great diversity of thought on that board. So that was really my first experience. I was also on the Century Bank board, which was a $3 billion bank in Massachusetts, and I was the first woman on that board as well. And then when I departed from that board a few years ago, there were 3 women, including one woman of color, and when I left that board, they replaced me with another woman. So I'm happy to say that they're still very much focused on diversity.
I would love your experience as, I don't know if you meant it to be as a trailblazer, but if you're an early woman or certainly the first woman on a board, it probably changes things. We had Cheryl Batchelder on our podcast, and she was the first female on some of her boards, and she served on high-profile ones from Pier 1 Imports to U.S. Foods to True Value to Chick-fil-A, etc. And she was explaining how the board changed as soon as the first woman came in the room. For example, no more martinis at lunch and things like that we might laugh at today. But she said, but you don't know what it was like when there were all men, and now suddenly there's a woman, and they're trying to figure out what to do and how to do it differently. What was your experience like?
It was very similar to that. That for me, being on the Century Bank board as the first woman, there were some practices that they were doing that I really didn't feel were the best utilization of board time, so we say. And so I was willing to speak up. None of the other men seemed to speak up, but at one point I was willing to just ask the question about why are we continuing to do this. And after the meeting, I got amazing support from the men saying, I'm so glad you asked that question.
Huh.
But it was interesting for me because they, again, were not willing to speak up themselves. But I also had the experience of, on the Sonesta board, when we first put a woman on that board, she never opened her mouth for, I'd say, the first 2 or 3 years that she was on the Sonesta board. So, as I said, I think it can really go both ways in terms of women being trailblazers. And in addition, it can also go a number of ways. Some women say, well, I've made it, but I don't want to be necessarily considered as a woman, so I'm not necessarily going to propose other women to join this board. Whereas increasingly now, women are saying, who are first on the board, okay, I'm the first, but we really need to add more women to this board and get to, ideally, to at least 3 women, which is really when women tend to have a greater voice in the boardroom.
I would love your thoughts on this. Let's pretend we're at the National Conversation event on November 21st, and someone says, I've been offered an opportunity to be the first board member at a company. I imagine some people might feel like, oh, I'm going to be a trailblazer. This could be great. I'm a pioneer. But sometimes it's the pioneers who get the arrows. So how do you help someone manage those expectations and know what they're getting into?
Well, again, I think it really has to do with the culture of the board. And as we know, every boardroom has its own unique culture. Mm-hmm. And so that woman may, be willing to be the trailblazer and break into that culture, but she'll have a much, much easier time about it if there's another woman there as well. And that could be a question that she asks a board. Well, would you consider adding a second woman as well? And one of the statistics that I think is very interesting that we produce is over 60% of the boards that add women year over year do so by adding a board seat, not by necessarily replacing a man with that woman. So there's no reason why people could not go and add, if they had no women on their board, they could easily add two at the same time.
That's a very interesting point, and we are seeing that trend across corporations as they think about adding more diversity, as we talked about in all its flavors before. It's not like people are putting their hand up and saying, I will retire early. So we are seeing this trend of more companies adding more seats. And do you endorse that as the right way to go, or do you think organizations should do something differently to shake up the existing board?
One of the things that I've experienced, both on the boards that I've been on as well as in consulting with a number of CEOs, is how difficult it is for CEOs, chairman, head of the nominating committee, whoever it is who's tasked with telling someone that their time on the board is up. That is one of the most difficult jobs people avoid doing. So a lot of the time, everyone recognizing that there's a board member who should no longer be on the board, but no one has the courage to tell that board member that it's time for them to leave. And so I think if there can be more of a norm that people are on a board for a certain amount of time, and then it's very appropriate for them to leave that board, I think that would certainly help that problem.
It sounds like the Supreme Court where you get a job for life.
That's the way a lot of people look at it, boards can be pretty lucrative, and they certainly don't want to give up that lucrative compensation if they any earlier than they have to.
Right. Now, it is a process and it is a journey for someone to get their first board seat. And there's a book that you really highly recommend called The Board Game, right? So that women can understand how to position themselves for board service? Yes,
absolutely. Betsy Berkmer-Cordere, who is the CEO of 2020 Women on Boards, wrote that book. She's coming out with a new book any day now, a second book that also talks about getting on a board and board service. So it's called The Board Game by Betsy Berkmer-Cordere. The other thing that Betsy does is she runs Get On Board workshops in various cities throughout the year, which are small groups of 20 or so women, really helping them position themselves, use their networks to really give them great take-home strategies for how to find a board seat.
And in terms of what underpins all of this, right, because we hinted this a little bit earlier, that there's some great statistics and the database you have and the information you've collected, which makes it such a powerful story. And my understanding is you do an annual refresh, so you've got some information that comes out at the National Conversation event. We'll hear about that on November 21st. I'd love to hear more about that, where we stand today, where we've come from, and also your goals for us to get to for the future. Mm-hmm.
So in 2011, which was the first year we produced our research, we tracked the Fortune 1000. Up until that point, the only statistics that we were aware of were people tracking the Fortune 500, and so we felt we wanted to expand the database. And at that point in 2011, the number of board seats on the Fortune 1000 was 14.6%. In that list, in 2017, we reached our goal of 20% of the board seats being held by women. And so we decided to expand our database to the Russell 3000. And so since 2017, when the Fortune 1000 was over 20%, the Russell 3000 was at 16%. In 2018, it went up to 17.7%. And on November 21st or earlier, everyone will hear where we are in 2019. But it appears that all I can say is we're gaining momentum, which is a great place to be. So I think that the idea really has caught on. I think some of the legislation, especially the California law that requiring companies to add women on their boards, I think companies are waking up to realize that this is a corporate imperative. It's a must-have, not a nice-to-have.
And what do you think accounts for the fact that the smaller companies are moving towards this slower? Is it perhaps there's more activist activities for the bigger companies, so there's more pressure on them and they're adjusting faster? What would you account for the difference?
Yeah, we've seen that consistently, that larger companies are more diverse than smaller ones. And I think there's a number of reasons. The larger ones are more visible. You could argue that they may be recognize the value of diversity, because they've got a very diverse workforce, and they also are more apt to cast a broader net when looking for board members, whereas smaller companies are still, I believe, their nominating process is few of the board members sit around and say, okay, who do you know? Mm-hmm. And they know their golf buddies.
Right.
And so those are the people that tend to get on the smaller company boards because the male directors, don't necessarily know qualified women. There are plenty of them out there. And I am the first one to debunk the myth that there aren't enough qualified women. There are plenty of qualified women. And again, the men, especially on these smaller boards, just don't know them.
And I would argue that this is a fascinating set of statistics from what we started out early in the conversation saying traditionally they wanted a CEO or maybe a CFO, so those sorts of people to move into a board role. And given the shocking difference between the percentage of women on boards versus those in the C-suite and how much lower that is, it's an amazing achievement that you have gotten boards as high as they are. Is now the opportunity really to push to get the C-suite to have more gender diversity?
Well, that would be great to do that as well, but I still believe we still have work to do on the board level. And I think diverse boards are certainly more receptive to having women CEOs, and vice versa. We found that when women are CEOs, they're significantly more. They significantly have more diverse boards than male CEOs.
Interesting.
So, so that's again, it goes both ways, but we really want women in all areas to be able to advance.
Well, I am very proud and congratulations on your achievements that you've gotten as we get towards 2020, it sounds like we're pretty darn close to making that goal at all levels, which is great. Not that we should take our foot off the pedal, but that is significant and wonderful strides. And I'm thrilled to be a part of the organization, certainly for the Boston location chapter and the November 21st conversation happening not only across the U.S., but you've got several international locations, I believe Mexico and London. So it's thrilled to see how much this is growing and developing. Clearly, we all want to be tuned in to see the latest statistics will be coming out around that time. So this is the type of opportunity that people would probably be very excited about. They want to learn more and be in touch with the organization. Stephanie, how should they go about doing that?
Okay, so first of all, I want to say that the national conversation is open to everyone and anyone. Even younger people who may be just beginning to think about being on board or who haven't even thought about it yet. On up to senior executives. There's really something at least for everyone. The place to go is to our website, 2020wob.com. That is where people can register to attend. We also are, of course, looking for table sponsors. If someone would want to put together a table of clients or employees of qualified or even more junior women, that would be great as well. There's really an opportunity for everyone to participate. Really, we encourage everyone to participate, to join the movement, if they believe that the world and the companies would be a better place if women had a greater voice.
Well, I can tell you,
really what it's about.
I'm a big fan myself. I will tell you as well, I'm the only male on the Boston steering committee, but I guess I get to represent the rest of us who would like to see more women on the board too.
Well, and now now you can understand how we women have feel.
We had a good laugh about it at the first steering committee meeting.
And we would love to have more men participate and encourage more men to participate. And we usually do have men at these events. Not as many as we would like, but we certainly have some. We certainly give men an opportunity to be on our panels and be our keynotes because, again, we realize that women can't do this by themselves. We really need men to support this initiative, and it benefits them as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, Stephanie, we were delighted to have you on the show today and to talk all about the goal of the 2020 Women on Board movement. Thank you for sharing your insights and helping all of us to be more excited to be boardroom bound.
Well, thank you, Alexander. It's great to be with you.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Stephanie Sonnabend. It's exciting to hear what in 9 short years the 2020 Women on Board movement has accomplished. Of course, there's so much more to do, but it's a great start. So we heard about why it's essential to women on boards, how much better companies do when they have that situation, and what we can all do to help, including the national conversation event happening on November 21st. I'm thrilled to be a member of the steering committee for the Boston. I represent all men on that, which we have a good laugh in the steering committee every time. And I would just encourage people, this is the type of organization not only helping promote the gender approach for diversity for boards, but also training, educating, preparing people to be ready for a board role. And if you head over to podcast.gordon.edu, you will get links to all of the resources that we talked about today. And maybe the most important thing, what I want to leave you with at the end is that the Boardroom Bound team and I are just so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any of the high-quality content we bring to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.